How does the wisest man who ever lived become a cautionary tale of spiritual failure? How does someone who receives divine wisdom directly from God himself end up turning away from the very source of that wisdom? Today we uncover the untold story of King Solomon, a man whose extraordinary beginning led to an extraordinary fall. Join us as we explore not just the glory of his reign, but the darkness that consumed his heart, the compromise that destroyed his legacy, and what his story means for us today. Solomon's story begins not with his own ambition, but with his father David's passion for God. Born into a royal household that had experienced both divine blessing and human failure, Solomon grew up watching his father navigate the complexities of leadership while maintaining a heart that pursued God despite its flaws. The young prince witnessed David's psalms of worship, his military victories, and his moments of profound spiritual failure. This environment shaped Solomon's understanding that even kings must bow before the Almighty. The cultural context of ancient Israel provided the backdrop for Solomon's formation. Israel stood at the crossroads of major trade routes, surrounded by nations that worshipped multiple gods and practiced customs that directly opposed the worship of Yahweh. Solomon's education would have included not just Hebrew traditions and law, but exposure to the wisdom literature of surrounding cultures. Egyptian wisdom texts, Mesopotamian proverbs, and philosophical traditions from across the ancient Near East flowed through the royal court, creating an intellectual environment that was both rich and potentially dangerous for a young mind. David's instructions to his son reveal the foundation intended for Solomon's reign. As recorded in 1 Kings chapter 2, David charged Solomon to walk in God's ways, keep his statutes, commandments, and laws as written in the law of Moses, so that he might prosper in all he did and wherever he went. This wasn't merely political advice. It was spiritual preparation for a role that would require divine wisdom beyond human capability. David understood that Israel's king must be God's representative, not merely a political leader. Two significant anecdotes from Solomon's early years reveal his character and potential. First, when Adonijah attempted to claim the throne before David's death, Solomon's response demonstrated both political acumen and respect for divine authority. Rather than seeking revenge immediately, he showed mercy while establishing clear boundaries, revealing a mind capable of both justice and restraint. Second, his famous dream at Gibeon, where God offered him anything he desired, showed a heart that still prioritized wisdom over personal gain. As recorded in 1 Kings 3:09, Solomon asked for an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. The formative years also included Solomon's exposure to his father's mistakes. David's affair with Bathsheba, his murder of Uriah, and the subsequent family conflicts provided Solomon with first-hand knowledge of how even God's anointed could fall when they compromised their principles. These early lessons would prove prophetic, as Solomon would later repeat many of his father's errors on an even grander scale. Yet in his youth, these experiences seemed to cultivate humility and a recognition of his need for divine guidance. Solomon's initial acts as king demonstrated the wisdom that would make him legendary throughout the ancient world. His first major challenge came when two women claimed the same baby, leading to his famous judgment to divide the child in half. This decision revealed not just intelligence, but deep understanding of human nature, maternal love, and the power of creative problem-solving. 1 Kings 3:28 records that all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. The construction of the temple marked Solomon's transition from promising young king to internationally recognized ruler. This wasn't merely a building project. It was the fulfillment of David's deepest desire and God's promise to establish a permanent dwelling place among his people. The temple required unprecedented coordination of resources, involving 30,000 Israelites working in Lebanon, 70,000 carriers, 80,000 stonecutters, and 3,300 foremen overseeing the work. The project took 7 years and represented the largest construction undertaking in Israel's history. International recognition began flowing toward Solomon as his reputation for wisdom spread. The Queen of Sheba's visit, recorded in 1 Kings 10, represents just one example of how foreign dignitaries sought his counsel. She came with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold, and precious stones, and left declaring that the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. This wasn't flattery. It was the acknowledgement of a ruler whose intellectual capacity transcended cultural boundaries. Solomon's judicial reforms established systems that would influence legal thinking for millennia. His ability to discern truth, render just decisions, and create legal precedents attracted people from across the known world. The Book of Proverbs preserves many of his judicial insights, revealing a mind that could distill complex situations into memorable principles. His administration became a model of efficiency, with 12 officers providing food for his household in monthly rotations, ensuring neither waste nor want. The growth of Israel's influence under Solomon's leadership transformed the nation from a regional power to an international force. Trade relationships extended from Egypt to Mesopotamia, with Solomon's merchants bringing exotic goods, knowledge, and cultural exchange to Israel. His military strength included 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, stationed in chariot cities throughout the kingdom. Unlike his father's reign, which focused on conquest, Solomon's era emphasized diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. Economic prosperity reached unprecedented levels as Solomon's wisdom translated into practical success. His annual income exceeded 666 talents of gold, not including revenue from merchants, trade, Arabian kings, and governors of the country. The silver in Jerusalem became as common as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore trees. This wasn't just material blessing. It was evidence of divine favor flowing through wise leadership and careful stewardship. During the height of his reign, Solomon's wisdom became a source of international wonder and local pride. 1 Kings 4:29-31 declares that God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding, and largeness of heart, like the sand on the seashore. Thus, Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East, and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. This wasn't merely intellectual superiority, it was divine gift manifested through human vessel, creating a reputation that drew seekers from every corner of the known world. The magnificence of Solomon's palace and administrative buildings reflected the prosperity of his kingdom. His house took 13 years to build, constructed with cedar from Lebanon, precious stones, and elaborate craftsmanship that rivaled any structure in the ancient world. The throne room, overlaid with pure gold and featuring 6 steps flanked by 12 lions, became a symbol of royal authority unlike any other. Visitors described it as exceeding anything they had imagined possible, with ivory, gold, and precious stones creating an atmosphere of otherworldly splendor. Solomon's literary achievements during this period established him as more than a ruler. He became a philosopher, poet, and wisdom teacher whose influence extended far beyond politics. He spoke 3,000 proverbs and composed 1,005 songs, covering topics from natural science to human behavior. His botanical knowledge spanned from the cedar trees of Lebanon to the hyssop growing out of walls. He spoke about animals, birds, creeping things, and fish, demonstrating an intellectual curiosity that embraced all of God's creation. The temple's completion represented the pinnacle of both architectural achievement and spiritual significance. When the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the most holy place, the glory of the Lord filled the house so completely that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud. This divine validation confirmed that Solomon's greatest achievement wasn't his wisdom, wealth, or political success. It was creating a place where God chose to manifest his presence among his people. International alliances multiplied Solomon's influence throughout the region. His marriage alliance with Pharaoh's daughter brought Egyptian support and demonstrated Israel's elevated status among nations. Trade agreements with Hiram of Tyre, commercial partnerships extending to distant lands, and diplomatic relationships that spanned from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt created a network of influence that made Israel the envy of surrounding kingdoms. The daily provisions for Solomon's household reveal the scale of his prosperity. 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. This abundance wasn't mere luxury. It was evidence of a kingdom so blessed that even the king's daily needs exceeded the annual resources of many nations. The scope of this provision demonstrates how divine blessing had multiplied beyond anything Israel had previously experienced. Yet within this unprecedented success lay the seeds of future compromise. The very international relationships that brought prosperity also brought exposure to foreign customs and religious practices. The wealth that demonstrated God's blessing began creating distance from the dependence that had originally attracted divine favor. The wisdom that drew international recognition started generating pride that would eventually overshadow humility. The abundance that should have inspired deeper gratitude instead fostered an appetite for even greater excess. The first subtle compromises appeared in Solomon's approach to marriage alliances. While initially these political unions seemed like wisdom, securing peace through diplomatic relationships, they introduced elements that would eventually undermine his spiritual foundation. His marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, while politically advantageous, represented the beginning of a pattern that would eventually include 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines from nations specifically forbidden by God for intermarriage with Israel. Solomon's increasing reliance on human wisdom rather than divine guidance marked another critical turning point. The very gift that had made him great, supernatural wisdom from God, began to be supplemented and eventually replaced by the accumulated wisdom of other cultures. Egyptian philosophy, Mesopotamian literature, and the religious practices of surrounding nations started influencing his thinking. What began as intellectual curiosity gradually became spiritual compromise as foreign ideas began competing with revealed truth. The multiplication of wealth, while initially a sign of God's blessing, created new temptations that Solomon hadn't faced during his more humble beginnings. Deuteronomy 17:17 specifically warned that Israel's king should not multiply silver and gold for himself. Yet Solomon's annual income eventually reached staggering proportions. The accumulation of wealth became an end in itself rather than a means to serve God and bless others. Prosperity that should have increased his gratitude instead increased his sense of personal achievement. Military expansion, though providing security, gradually shifted Solomon's confidence from divine protection to human strength. His accumulation of chariots and horses directly violated Deuteronomy 17:16, which commanded that the king shall not multiply horses for himself. What seemed like practical wisdom, building strong defenses, actually represented a gradual shift in trust from God's supernatural protection to human military might. This change in perspective would prove foundational to his later spiritual decline. The administrative demands of his expanding kingdom required increasingly complex systems that moved Solomon away from the direct, personal leadership style that had characterized his early reign. The need to manage vast construction projects, international trade relationships, and complex diplomatic arrangements consumed time and attention that had previously been devoted to seeking God's will. Efficiency became more important than spirituality, and management skills took precedence over spiritual sensitivity. Foreign wives brought not only political advantages, but also religious practices that directly contradicted Israel's covenant with God. 1 Kings 11:4 records that, "When Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David." This wasn't sudden apostasy. It was the gradual result of daily exposure to competing worldviews and religious practices. Each small compromise prepared the way for larger ones. Each accommodation made the next one easier to justify. The construction of high places for foreign gods represented Solomon's most visible spiritual compromise. He built worship sites for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Moloch, the abomination of the people of Ammon, on the hill east of Jerusalem. These weren't merely cultural accommodations for his foreign wives. They were statements that other gods deserved worship alongside the God of Israel. The man who had built the magnificent temple for Yahweh was now providing alternative worship sites that directly contradicted the first commandment. The consequences of Solomon's spiritual compromise began manifesting during his lifetime, though their full impact wouldn't be realized until after his death. God's anger burned against Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and specifically commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. The divine warning was clear. Because Solomon had broken covenant, God would surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Internal dissensions started emerging as Solomon's policies created resentment among his own people. The forced labor required for his building projects, the heavy taxation needed to maintain his lavish lifestyle, and the preferential treatment given to foreign interests over Israelite concerns created growing discontent. Jeroboam's rebellion, though initially unsuccessful, represented the beginning of political opposition that would eventually split the kingdom into two hostile nations. The prophet Ahijah's pronouncement to Jeroboam revealed the extent of divine judgment coming upon Solomon's house. Taking a new garment and tearing it into 12 pieces, Ahijah gave 10 pieces to Jeroboam with the message, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to you." This dramatic prophetic act demonstrated that Solomon's compromise wouldn't just affect him personally, it would destroy the united kingdom his father David had established. Financial strain began appearing as Solomon's expenses exceeded even his enormous income. The 120 talents of gold received annually from Ophir, while substantial, proved insufficient to maintain his expanding household, continue his building projects, and support his elaborate court. The need to give 20 cities in Galilee to Hiram of Tyre to pay for temple materials revealed that even the world's wealthiest king could overspend when appetites became disconnected from wisdom. Spiritual deadness replaced the vibrant relationship with God that had characterized Solomon's early reign. The man who had once received direct divine revelation now depended entirely on human counsel and foreign advisors. Prayer became ceremonial rather than conversational, and divine guidance was replaced by political calculation. The heart that had once burned with passion for God's presence grew cold toward spiritual matters, while remaining passionate about material pursuits. Military threats emerged as surrounding nations sensed weakness in Israel's spiritual foundation. Hadad the Edomite and Rezon of Damascus became persistent adversaries, creating problems that hadn't existed during Solomon's earlier years, when divine favor provided supernatural protection. These external pressures revealed that compromise with God's commands had weakened not just Solomon's spiritual condition, but also Israel's national security. As Solomon's reign drew to its close, the contrast between his early promise and final condition became tragically apparent. The man who had asked for wisdom to govern God's people had used that wisdom to justify abandoning God's laws. The king who had declared that the Lord was the only true God now worshipped multiple deities. The ruler who had brought unprecedented prosperity to Israel had set in motion the forces that would tear the kingdom apart. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon's later years, reveals his final reflections on a life that had contained everything the world considers valuable, yet had ultimately proven empty. "Vanity of vanities," he wrote, "all is vanity." The man who had possessed unlimited wealth declared that riches couldn't satisfy. The king who had enjoyed unlimited pleasure found it meaningless. The scholar who had accumulated unlimited knowledge discovered it was all vanity and grasping for the wind. Solomon's famous conclusion in Ecclesiastes 12:13-14 represents his ultimate realization. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. The man who had spent decades exploring every alternative to simple obedience finally acknowledged that fearing God and keeping his commandments was the only source of true meaning and lasting satisfaction. His reflections on time reveal a mature understanding of life's rhythms and God's sovereignty that seemed absent during his years of compromise. "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven," he wrote, acknowledging that human planning and divine timing don't always align. This wasn't the voice of a man still intoxicated with his own wisdom, but someone who had learned through painful experience that human understanding has limits that only divine perspective can transcend. The king who had once believed his wisdom could solve any problem finally admitted the limitations of human knowledge. "As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything." This acknowledgement of mystery represented a return to the humility that had characterized his early relationship with God. Though it came too late to prevent the consequences of his years of pride, Solomon's legacy became a cautionary tale rather than an inspiring example. While he had accomplished more than any king before or after him, his compromise had set in motion forces that would divide Israel permanently. The United Kingdom that David had established through faith and obedience was torn apart by Solomon's disobedience and pride. Future generations would measure their kings not by Solomon's achievements, but by David's faithfulness, revealing which legacy truly mattered in God's eyes. His final understanding of wealth's proper place represents perhaps his most important insight. "Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life which God gives him, for it is his heritage." Prosperity wasn't inherently evil, but it was meant to be received as gift rather than pursued as goal, enjoyed with gratitude rather than grasped with greed. The conclusion of Solomon's story serves as a timeless warning about the danger of gradual compromise. His fall didn't happen overnight. It was the result of small decisions that accumulated over decades until they became an unstoppable avalanche. Each choice seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they created a pattern that led away from God and toward destruction. The man who had everything discovered that nothing matters if you lose your relationship with God. What does Solomon's story mean for us today? First, it reveals that no amount of blessing, wisdom, or success provides immunity from spiritual failure. If the wisest man who ever lived could fall through compromise, none of us can afford to be overconfident about our spiritual strength. Our greatest achievements might actually become our greatest vulnerabilities if they lead us toward pride and away from dependence on God. Second, Solomon's experience demonstrates how compromise typically works, not through dramatic rebellion, but through gradual accommodation. We don't usually wake up one morning and decide to abandon our faith. Instead, we make small compromises that seem harmless in isolation, but create momentum toward larger failures. The key to preventing spiritual disaster isn't just avoiding big sins. It's maintaining vigilance against small compromises that can accumulate into spiritual catastrophe. Third, the contrast between Solomon's early humility and later pride reveals the crucial importance of maintaining proper perspective on our gifts and achievements. The wisdom that made Solomon great was a gift from God, not a personal accomplishment. When he began treating divine gifts as personal achievements, he set himself up for the pride that led to his fall. May we all remember that every good and perfect gift comes from above, and respond with gratitude rather than pride. Fourth, Solomon's multiple marriages illustrate how relationships that compromise our values will eventually compromise our faith. The influences we allow into our closest relationships will shape our thinking, values, and spiritual direction. If the wisest man in history couldn't maintain his spiritual integrity while surrounded by influences that pulled him away from God, how much more careful should we be about the voices we allow to shape our hearts and minds? Fifth, his experience with wealth reveals both its potential blessing and its inherent danger. Prosperity isn't evil, but it can become spiritually dangerous if it creates independence from God or feeds appetites that grow beyond wisdom's control. Let us learn to hold material blessings lightly, receiving them with gratitude while remembering that our true treasure lies in heaven, where thieves cannot steal and moths cannot destroy. The most sobering lesson from Solomon's life may be that knowledge alone cannot protect us from spiritual failure. He knew God's law better than almost anyone, had experienced divine presence in extraordinary ways, and possessed wisdom that exceeded all others. Yet knowledge without ongoing relationship, wisdom without continuing humility, and blessing without persistent gratitude all proved insufficient to keep him faithful. Head knowledge must be accompanied by heart transformation, and initial spiritual experiences must be renewed through daily spiritual disciplines. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Solomon's remarkable yet tragic story. His life provides both inspiration and warning, showing us the heights that are possible when we walk with God and the depths that become inevitable when we walk away from Him. If this message has challenged your thinking about success, wisdom, or spiritual faithfulness, please let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of biblical characters and their timeless lessons.